Hello and welcome back to another little Piskie Bite. Miniature episodes where we explore the folklore, history and legends from across Devon and Cornwall. Hope you're all keeping well and you've been having a good week. Thank you to everyone who's been listening and supporting this series so far. If you're enjoying it, then please don't forget to give us a like, subscribe and spread the word around if you can. A big thank you to all the fantastic patrons, and a particular shout out to the new patrons who've signed up. You guys help to make this series possible, really. If you fancy helping out by supporting further, you can check out my Patreon page at patreon.com/The Piskie Trap. Some of you have been in touch with your feedback and lovely comments regarding the last episode where we had a bit of a case update, and we also looked at the story of fortune teller Beatrice Small, so thanks to everyone for that. Also a massive thank you to everyone who's been in touch with regard to the talks in May and June. So I'm going to be giving a talk drawing on some of the research from this series, taking a look at some of the history surrounding witchcraft in Cornwall. The talk at the Royal Cornwall Museum on the 15th of May is now sold out. I'm also going to be at the Acorn in Penzance on the 23rd of May, the Polly over in Falmouth on the 6th and 12th of June, and into Bodmin on the 7th of June. So if you're interested and fancy coming along to one of those, it'd be great to see you there. I'll pop some links to the venues in the show notes for that. Right, I think that's all the news and updates for now, so let's crack on. This episode I've put together actually following a request from Mike, one of the patrons, who said he wanted, and I quote, something ghosty. So we'll be exploring a couple of ghostly tales. And I've chosen these ones for a couple of reasons, really. To my mind, they sort of fit together quite well as stories because they've all come from the far west of Cornwall. They all involve ghostly female figures, and they all have a connection to the sea. So, here are some spectres of the sea. The apparition of a lady with a lantern, always on one part of the Cornish coast, foretells a storm and shipwrecks. She is supposed to be searching for her child who was drowned, whilst she was saved, because she was afraid to trust it out of her arms. That was a quote from Margaret Ann Courtney's Cornish Feasts and Folklore. And this story is usually known as The Lady and the Lantern, and it seems to come from the area around St Ives. I first encountered it when I was doing some research on something else, and it also cropped up in Robert Hunt's Popular Romances of the West of England, which we've talked about a number of times in the past. He retells the story in much more detail and in a typically dramatic fashion. It was a melancholy time. For more than a month, there had been a succession of storms, each one more severe than the preceding one. At length, one evening, just about dusk, a large ship came suddenly out of the mist. Her position, it was at once discovered, equally by those on board and by the people on shore, was perilous beyond hope. The sailors, as soon as they saw how near they were to the shore, made every effort to save the ship, and then to prepare for saving themselves. The tempest raged with such fury from the west that the ship parted her anchors at the moment her strain came upon them, and she swung around, her only sail flying into ribbons in the gale, rushing, as it were, eagerly upon her fate. Presently she struck violently upon a sunken rock, and her masts went by the board, the waves sweeping over her and clearing her decks. Many perished at once, and as each successive wave urged her onward, others of the hardy and daring seamen were swept into the angry sea. Notwithstanding the severity of the storm, a boat was manned by the St. Ives fishermen and launched from within the pier. Their perfect knowledge of their work enabled them, by the efforts of willing hearts, anxiously desiring to succour the distressed, to round the pier head and to row towards the ship. These fishermen brought their boat near to the ship. It was impossible to get close to her, and they called to the sailors on board to throw them ropes. This they were enabled to do, and some 2 or 3 of the sailors lowered themselves by their aid and were hauled into the boat. Then a group appeared on the deck, surrounding and supporting a lady who held a child in her arms. They were imploring her to give her charge into the strong arms of a man ere they endeavoured to pass her from the ship to the boat. The lady could not be prevailed upon to part with the infant. The ship was fast breaking up. Not a moment could be lost. So the lady, holding her child, was lowered into the sea, and eagerly the fishermen drew her through the waves towards the boat. In her passage, the lady had fainted, and she was taken into the boat without the infant. The child had fallen from her arms and was lost in the boiling waters. Many of the crew were saved by these adventurous men and taken safely into St. Ives. Before morning, the shore was strewed with fragments of wreck, and the mighty ship had disappeared. Life returned to the lady, but finding that her child was gone, it returned without hope, and she speedily closed her eyes in death. In the churchyard they buried her, but shortly after her burial, a lady was seen to pass over the wall of the churchyard onto the beach and walk towards the island. There she spent hours amidst the rocks, looking for her child, and, not finding it, she would sigh deeply and return to her grave. When the nights were tempestuous or very dark, she carried a lantern, but on fine nights she made her search without a light. The lady and the lantern have ever been regarded as predictors of disaster on this shore. I find this one a really interesting local story that seems to fit into a particular pattern that you see across ghost stories. Those of you who've been listening for a while now might recall that last year I chatted to Mike O'Connor about the white hair of Lou, where you have this tragic story of a woman whose spirit returned in the form of a white hare to warn sailors of storms at sea. This idea of the ghost appearing as a warning or an omen, if you like. Robert Hunt himself says at the end of his retelling, and I quote, "May not the Lady Sibella, or Sibbets, mentioned by Mr. Blight, as passing from the shore to a rock off Morva, be but another version of this story?" I can't be certain, but the Blight he's referring to could be Joseph Blight, who illustrated William Bottrell's work. So it sounds like he had passed down a similar story from Morva, which is a few miles west of St. Ives. So it could be that this was part of a local storytelling tradition. The next story that I want to explore takes us to Land's End, and it's centered around a strangely shaped rock just off the mainland. I first encountered the tale when I was again reading Cornish feasts and folklore, but shortly after that I discovered Mike O'Connor's retelling of it in his brilliant book, Cornish Folk Tales, which I highly recommend. And it's that version that I'd like to share with you. It's known as the Irish Lady. Long ago, a ship from Ireland was wrecked at night on this very rock. Everyone on board was drowned apart from one lady. The morning after the wreck, she was seen sitting on top of the rock. But the storm was still raging, and it was quite impossible to rescue her. The seas were too rough and the cliffs too steep. Days and nights passed as the people watched the poor woman from the shore, but they still could not reach her. Eventually, the poor lady died, and her body was washed into the sea. But since that day, when the winds and waves are high, fishermen often see a lady peacefully sitting on this rock with a rose in her mouth, quite indifferent to the raging of the storm. I was drawn to this story in part, I think, because of the imagery that it conjures up. Anyone who knows that area of the coastline near Land's End knows just how dramatic that scenery is. And so this tale of the ship wrecked in this great storm and this solitary figure of a woman stranded at the top of the rock as the storm rages around her, and her reappearance in spirit form as a sort of very serene entity. I suppose I found that quite captivating, really. Margaret Ann Courtney, at the end of her retelling of the story, says, "This is most probably a fanciful tale, as the rock bears some resemblance to a human figure." There's actually a poem said to have been written by Sir Humphrey Davy about the Irish lady. And the final verse reads, "The British bark bore her across the ocean. From the west the whirlwind rose, the fire-fraught clouds of heaven were mingled with the wave. The shattered bark sunk at thy feet, Bolerium and the white surge closed on green Erin's daughter." Our next tale takes us from the Land's End further west to the Isles of Scilly, and in fact about as far west as you can get from there. Rosevear is the largest of what are known as the Western Rocks, and the whole area is famous for its shipwrecks over the centuries. But there's one particular tale that I'd like to focus on. It's a story I first encountered quite a while back when I was reading Nicola Sly's book, A Ghostly Almanac of Devon and Cornwall, where she writes, "Workmen who lived on the island while constructing the Bishop's Rock lighthouse in the 1850s reported a number of ghostly happenings, and there have also been reports of the sound of a baby crying and of a woman's voice sweetly singing a lullaby." This story has its origins in events that occurred back in 1784, when a packet ship called the Nancy was wrecked. I've managed to find an article in the Reading Mercury dated the 15th of March 1784, which reads as follows. "The following is the substance of the letter from Scilly, which gives an account to the directors of the India Company of the loss of the Nancy packet. A person whose business it is to attend at the Scilly Islands, on seeing some letters washed on shore, which, on opening, he found came from India, suspecting some vessel from that part of the world to be lost, offered a large reward for any person to go off. Accordingly, some people ventured, who discovered the wreck under water, and with great difficulty got up a packet bag which contained several letters. The article goes on to say, the crew of the Nancy East India packet consisted of 36 men, besides 12 gentlemen and ladies, passengers who all perished. The following are a part of the passengers known to have been on board the Nancy at the time she went down. Mr. Percy, surgeon to Sir Edward Hughes, Mr. Ashburner, late of the council at Bombay, Mr. Bond, Mr. Page and Son, Mr. A. Thompson, Captain Haldane, his first and second mate, Mr. Mackenzie, Mrs. Cargill, the celebrated actress, who went to India about 2 years since, and an infant child of 20 months old. The bodies were mostly naked, and supposed to have been in bed at the time. Mrs. Cargill was found floating in her shift, with the infant in her arms. I was fascinated by this, and instantly I wanted to know more about this Mrs. Cargill. So it turns out that Anne Cargill was one of the most famous stage actors and singers of the day, and much of her life and her exploits was closely followed by the papers of the time. She appears to have been born Anne Brown in London in 1760, the daughter of a coal merchant named Edward Brown. Quite early on, she seems to have become something of a child star, basically, making her debut in 1771, so she was about 11 years old, at the Covent Garden Theatre. She goes on to have a really successful career in the theatre. And at the same time, there were all these scandals surrounding her relationships with various men and the fallouts with her father over parental authority. In 1775, when she was about 15, she ran away with a gunpowder maker named Miles Peter Andrews. The scandal meant that her father got a court order restraining her to his house. It didn't really go to plan, though, and she soon escaped. The following year, she was cast as Polly in a production of The Beggar's Opera, and this is when her father makes another attempt to seize her, this time while she's in a carriage in Bow Street. One of the papers at the time wrote, and I quote, "Friday night, Mr. Brown, the coal merchant, whose daughter eloped from him some months since, attempted to seize her, as she stopped in a coach at the end of the Playhouse Passage in Bow Street." A separate article in the Ipswich Post goes on to say, "The little siren was accompanied by her aunt, who made a great outcry and told the populace Mr. Brown was mad. The alarm presently reached the playhouse, and the theatrical garrison sallied out in great numbers, headed by Mr. M, B, W, and S, their full names aren't given, to relieve the distressed damsel. The thieves in the Beggar's Opera, armed with pistols and such, made a most formidable appearance, and the crowd was so numerous that for a considerable time the street was impassable. At length, however, the lady was handed into the playhouse in triumph, and, notwithstanding her great agitation of spirits, performed the part of Polly greatly to the satisfaction of a very numerous and brilliant audience, who received her with repeated shouts of applause." This is the sort of thing that seemed to happen in Anne's life. The public seemed to have really taken to her, despite the fact that scandal just seemed to follow her. In 1780, she eloped to Edinburgh with a man named Robert Cargill. But the marriage didn't last very long when Anne basically discovered that he was broke and was in fact on the run from his creditors. So she quickly legged it and went back to London to live with her aunt. Her theatrical career continued to flourish, and at this time she was said to have taken several different lovers, including running off to Bath with a man named George Coleman, who was actually the theatre manager's son, and later in 1782 she left England for India in the company of one John Haldane, a captain in the East India Company, who was to become the commander of the Nancy. So, coming back to that original article in the Reading Mercury, they write, "Mrs. Cargill was extremely successful in her theatrical Asiatic excursions. She played all her applauded opera characters at immense prices. Her benefit at Bengal amounted to the astonishing sum of 12,000 rupees. And what will surprise our theatrical readers, she performed the Grecian daughter with the utmost applause." Back in Britain, however, the Prime Minister at that time, William Pitt, saw the whole thing as, well, a bit of a scandal, really. And she and Haldane were basically ordered to come back to the UK. According to the paper regarding what happened, and I quote, The most probable conjecture on the loss of the Nancy East India packet is that she struck on the rocks in the night and went to pieces directly. It seems like they got lost north of the Scillies, not knowing exactly where they were, then turned back south, ending up on the western rocks. What seems clear is that the vessel struck violently against one of the rocks and began taking on water quickly. Some of the crew, it seems, tried to escape in little boats and headed for Roseveare. In the end, though, all were lost, and Anne was found floating near the shore of Roseveare with her child in her arms. Initially, she and Haldane, along with the child, were hastily buried on the island. But later, as soon as her identity was discovered, all three of them were taken back to St. Mary's and buried there. Since then, there have been stories that Anne still haunts the island of Roseveare. In the 1850s, construction began on the lighthouse at Bishop Rock, and it was during this time that there were reports of strange occurrences. According to a historical treatise by Edward Cumming and Todd Stevens entitled Wreck of the East India Company Packet Nancy, and I quote, "Legend has it that the workmen were not sorry to leave the island once the work was completed, not only because of the harsh and exposed conditions, but the fact that they were convinced Roseveare was haunted. During construction of their dwellings and work areas, they had found the bones of several individuals in the shallow soils of the island, and over the years they had been on the island, there had been several occasions where some of the workmen had been convinced they could hear a haunting lullaby sung by a young singer-actress called Anne Cargill to her young baby." End quote. According to Todd Stevens, during the construction, a blacksmith was left alone on the island for a time and said that he heard strains of beautiful music, and he knew it was music not of this earth. And basically he wouldn't be left alone on the island after that. There was a ballad written back in the 18th century, not long after the wreck of the Nancy, which lamented Anne's passing, and the opening verse reads as follows: "Dismal is the tale which I now unto you will relate. Hearts which are not cold to beauty must lament a fair one's fate. Cargill, who did rival Venus, now, alas, will charm no more. Each rose and lily now is faded, wrecked near Scilly's fatal shore." That's it for this Piskie Bite. I hope that you found it interesting. I chose to look at those stories because they all seem to fit quite well together and have similar themes that were all linked to the sea. If you have an idea or a request for an episode, then please feel free to get in touch. You can email me at thepiskietrap@gmail.com. But for now, that's it from me. We'll be back again very soon with another episode. In the meantime, thanks for listening.